On New Year's Eve, as the freezing winds of Aspen whipped through the mountain passes and bit at my skin, I stood before the massive oak doors of my family's estate while realizing that my life would never be the same. I am Deidre, 32 years old, an asset risk consultant who spent the last decade building a reputation for ruthlessness in the financial world, while quietly propping up the very people who now looked at me with pure disdain. I arrived at the grand entrance clutching a folder of documents that could have saved our family's legacy, yet my older sister blocked the path with a sneer that twisted her expensive features into something unrecognizable. "Stupid, useless trash like you isn't invited, so get lost and go home," she spat, her voice dripping with a malice that echoed through the marble foyer. Through the gap behind her, I could see my parents and my brother laughing around a table filled with crystal and silver, acting as if I were nothing more than a ghost haunting their perfect celebration. I didn't cry or beg for entry because the betrayal was finally complete, so I simply turned back to my car with a cold smile and pressed a single button on my phone that initiated a sequence they never saw coming. Within 15 minutes, the music stopped, and the screaming began as the reality of their choices hit them like a freight train. But before I reveal the devastation that followed, I want to hear from you. Please let me know in the comments what time it is and which city you are watching from, so I can see how far my story has traveled. Hit that like button and subscribe right now to hear exactly how one digital signature dismantled an empire and left my family begging for the mercy they refused to show me. Growing up in the shadow of the snow-capped peaks of Colorado meant living in a world where appearance was the only currency that truly mattered to my parents. My father, Franklin, was a man who built his identity on the prestige of being a top-tier fund manager, yet he lacked the discipline to maintain the wealth he so desperately craved to display. My mother, Beverly, dedicated every waking hour to climbing the social ladder of Aspen, often spending thousands of dollars on galas and designer wardrobes, while our internal bank accounts began to wither under the weight of her vanity. They viewed me as the family's greatest disappointment because I preferred studying financial law and risk assessment over attending the superficial debutante balls that my sister Savannah embraced with such fake elegance. Savannah was always the center of their universe, a woman who possessed a talent for spending money she never earned, while convincing everyone that she was the one managing the family's sophisticated investment portfolio. My younger brother Garrett was no better, as he spent his days racing expensive cars and racking up gambling debts that Franklin quietly buried to avoid any public scandal. I became the invisible pillar of the household, the one who worked 80 hours a week at a high-stakes firm just to ensure the lights stayed on in a mansion that was slowly being consumed by debt. Whenever I tried to warn Dad about the mounting interest rates or the danger of his leveraged lifestyle, he would wave me away with a condescending sigh and tell me that a mere consultant could never understand the complexities of real wealth. Mom would chime in by reminding me that my lack of social grace was the reason I would always be an outsider in my own home, regardless of how much money I contributed to their survival. They treated my financial contributions as an entitlement, a tax I had to pay just for the privilege of carrying the family name, while they lavished Savannah and Garrett with praise for their visionary spirits. I watched from the sidelines as they built a house of cards out of lies and borrowed credit, knowing that the foundation was rotting, but still hoping that my loyalty would one day be recognized as love. They never saw me as a daughter, but rather as a safety net they could trample upon whenever they needed to reach higher for a social status they could no longer afford. Every time Savannah insulted my career, or Garrett demanded a bailout for his latest failure, I bit my tongue and swallowed the bitterness, because I believed that family was supposed to endure the unbearable. I didn't realize back then that my silence was actually fueling their arrogance and providing them with the perfect weapon to eventually destroy my spirit. The irony of the situation was that while they were mocking my boring professional life, I was the only person in the world who truly understood the depth of the financial grave they were digging for themselves. I stayed in the shadows managing their risks and signing the papers that kept the creditors at bay, all while they planned a future that didn't include me in anything other than a financial capacity. 6 years ago, the tension in that house finally boiled over during a summer evening when I discovered that Franklin had attempted to use my personal credit score to secure a loan for Savannah's failing boutique. I confronted him in his mahogany-lined study, but instead of an apology, I received a lecture on how my individual success belonged to the collective legacy of the family. That was the night I realized I was being farmed for my resources, so I packed a single suitcase and moved to New York without looking back or asking for a single penny of support. I threw myself into the brutal world of corporate restructuring, specializing in identifying fraudulent patterns and reclaiming assets from entities that thought they were untouchable. During those lonely years in a cramped apartment, my only source of comfort was my best friend Julian, who worked as a senior compliance officer and understood the dark underbelly of the financial world. Julian was the person who sat with me through long nights of research and helped me process the emotional trauma of being a walking bank account for my own parents. He saw the scars that Savannah and Garrett had left on my confidence and reminded me that my value wasn't defined by the approval of people who only loved me for my utility. As my career skyrocketed and I began to earn a salary that eclipsed my father's peak earnings, the calls from Aspen started coming in with a frequency that was as predictable as it was insulting. Mom would call to complain about the rising costs of property taxes, while Garrett would leave frantic voicemails about car payments that were 3 months overdue. They never asked how I was doing or celebrated my promotions, as their only interest lay in when the next wire transfer would arrive to fund their mountain lifestyle. It was during a deep dive into the public records of our Aspen estate that I discovered Franklin had committed a fatal error by making me a co-signer on the primary mortgage years ago. He had done it secretly when I was a naive 24-year-old, thinking he could use my signature to tether me to his debts forever, without me ever realizing the power I now held. I didn't sue him immediately because a part of me was still trapped in the cycle of wanting to be the savior, so I decided to take a different approach. I used my growing capital to quietly buy up the secondary debts and liens that were accumulating against the family home through a series of anonymous holding companies. Julian helped me navigate the legal complexities of these acquisitions, warning me that I was becoming the landlord of my own nightmare, but I needed a way to protect my own credit from their reckless behavior. I was no longer just the daughter who paid the bills. I was becoming the silent owner of the very roof over their heads, while they continued to treat me like an unwanted servant. They had no idea that every time Savannah bragged about the family fortune, she was actually talking about assets that I had worked to secure under my own corporate umbrella. I spent those years building a fortress of legal protection around myself, waiting for the moment when the mask of their civility would finally drop so I could see them for who they truly were. 3 months before the catastrophic events of New Year's Eve, I received a notification from my bank that caused my blood to run cold as I stared at the screen of my laptop. Savannah had managed to gain access to my social security number and had successfully forged my signature on a massive line of credit intended to renovate her second home in the Hamptons. It wasn't just a simple case of theft. It was a calculated betrayal that put my entire professional license at risk because the loan was tied to an institution I consulted for. I immediately called Franklin to demand an explanation, but he simply told me that Savannah was going through a difficult divorce and needed the money to maintain her dignity during the legal proceedings. He had the audacity to suggest that I should be grateful to help my sister even after she had actively stolen from me to fund a lifestyle she couldn't maintain on her own. When I tried to reach out to Garrett to see if he knew about the fraud, I found out he had been using my name as a personal reference for high-stakes gambling markers in Las Vegas. The entire family was colluding to strip me of everything I had built, treating my life's work as a communal piggy bank that they could drain whenever they felt a slight inconvenience. I realized that my parents weren't just being negligent, they were actively participating in the destruction of my future to protect the image of their more socially acceptable children. Savannah sent me an email the following day that was filled with such arrogance, it made me physically ill, claiming that my corporate greed was a stain on the family and that I owed her for the years she spent staying in Aspen to take care of our aging parents. She failed to mention that her idea of taking care of them involved spending Mom's jewelry budget and making sure the staff catered to her every whim while I was the one paying for the health insurance. The reality of the situation was that they had moved beyond simple greed and into the territory of criminal exploitation, convinced that I would never have the courage to hold them accountable. I sat in my office for hours looking at the documents Julian had helped me compile, seeing the sheer scale of the identity theft and financial manipulation they had orchestrated. Every time I felt a spark of guilt about what I was planning to do, I would reread the transcript of a phone call where Beverly told a family friend that I was stable but dull, and mostly useful for handling the boring paperwork of the estate. They truly believed that because I was the responsible one, I was also the one who would never fight back, making me the perfect victim for their parasitic needs. I realized that if I didn't act now, they would eventually drag me down into the same financial abyss they were currently occupying, leaving me with a ruined reputation and a mountain of their debt. My decision was finalized when I discovered that Savannah had even convinced Arthur to sign over his remaining life insurance policy to her, leaving nothing for his own medical care in his final years. They were predators who shared my blood, and the time for being a protective shield was over because they had finally pushed me into a corner where my only choice was to strike back with everything I had. On the afternoon of December 31st, I drove through the winding mountain roads toward our family estate with a heavy heart and a folder that represented their final chance at redemption. I had prepared a legal settlement that would have consolidated their debts and allowed them to stay in the house under a strict repayment plan that I would oversee personally. I wanted to give them a way out of the criminal charges I could easily bring against Savannah and Garrett, provided they finally acknowledged the truth and agreed to live within their means. As I pulled up to the gate, I noticed the driveway was filled with the luxury vehicles of Aspen's elite, indicating that Mom was hosting another one of her lavish New Year's Eve parties. I walked toward the front door, feeling the weight of the cold air, only to be met by Savannah, who was wearing a dress that probably cost more than most people's annual rent. She didn't even wait for me to speak before she planted her feet on the threshold and gave me a look of pure, unadulterated hatred that told me everything I needed to know. "What are you doing here in those pathetic clothes, Deidre?" she asked with a sharp laugh that carried into the foyer where several guests were already holding glasses of champagne. She told me that I was a disgrace to the family's image and that my presence would only remind people of the lowly work I did for a living, which she claimed was beneath the Matthews name. I tried to push past her to speak to Dad, but he appeared behind her with a look of annoyance, as if my arrival was nothing more than a stain on his perfect evening. He didn't ask me why I was there, or even say hello. He simply told me to leave the documents with the maid and go find a hotel, because there was no room for me at the dinner table. Mom poked her head around the corner and told me that I should have called ahead so she could have prepared a smaller table in the kitchen for me, as the main dining room was reserved for important stakeholders. The humiliation was palpable, especially when I saw Garrett in the background smirking as he toasted to a group of his friends while pointedly ignoring my existence. Savannah leaned in close and whispered that I was nothing but a glorified accountant, who was lucky they even let me use their last name before she called me a stupid, useless piece of trash. She then reached out and physically shoved me back onto the stone steps, slamming the heavy oak door with such force that the sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent winter air. I stood there in the snow, clutching the folder of mercy that they had just spat upon, and realized that the person I used to be died in that moment. There would be no more bailing them out, no more protecting their reputation, and certainly no more paying for the roof that they had just barred me from entering. I walked back to my car with a terrifying sense of clarity, realizing that they had just handed me the moral permission to execute the plan I had spent months refining. They wanted me to be the ghost in their machine, the invisible force that provided the power while they enjoyed the light. So I decided it was time to turn the power off forever. Exactly 15 minutes after the door slammed in my face, I sat in the driver's seat of my SUV and pulled up the master control application for the holding company that now legally owned the deed to the Aspen estate. With a steady hand, I authorized the immediate termination of the right to occupy agreement that I had secretly kept active for them, which triggered an automated legal filing with the local sheriff's department. I then accessed the unified banking portal and placed a total freeze on every secondary credit card and bank account that was tied to my primary professional line of credit. This effectively cut off the funding for the very party they were currently hosting, ensuring that within minutes, every transaction made by the catering staff or the wine merchants would be declined. I didn't stop there, as I also sent a pre-formatted legal notice to the bank regarding the identity theft Savannah had committed, which automatically triggered a fraud investigation and a seizure of her personal assets. The one button I pressed was actually a pre-programmed macro that initiated 7 different legal and financial strikes against their lifestyle, all of which were entirely within my rights as the primary owner and victim of their fraud. I watched from the end of the driveway as the lights in the mansion flickered lightly, because I had also transferred the utility accounts back into my name and scheduled a change of service for that very hour. I knew that the catering manager would be the first to notice when his company's $20,000 payment was rejected by the system, causing a scene that no amount of social standing could hide. I felt no guilt as I watched the silhouette of the house, imagining the confusion turning into panic as Savannah tried to explain why her unlimited card was no longer working. They had called me useless, but they were about to find out that their entire world was built on the useless foundation I had provided for them out of a misplaced sense of duty. I called Julian and told him that the sequence was live, and he confirmed that the legal team was already standing by to handle the fallout of the eviction process. This wasn't a temper tantrum or a simple act of spite. It was a cold, calculated reclamation of my own life from the parasites who had been trying to drain it dry. I was done being the silent martyr for a family that didn't even have the decency to let me stand in their hallway on a holiday. They had played a dangerous game by trying to destroy the only person who was keeping them afloat, and they were about to learn the most expensive lesson of their lives. I put the car in gear and began to drive away from the estate, knowing that by the time I reached the bottom of the mountain, the screaming would be audible from the street. The power I held was never about the money itself. It was about the truth of who really provided for whom, and that truth was finally going to be public. The chaos began just as the local news was preparing to broadcast the countdown to the new year, but for the Matthews family, the countdown was for the end of their social existence. From my car parked at a nearby lookout, I could see the flashing blue and red lights of the sheriff's vehicles as they made their way up the private road to serve the emergency eviction and fraud warrants. Because Savannah had forged my signature on federal loan documents, the investigation had moved with a speed that only the American banking system can achieve when its own money is at risk. I received a flurry of frantic phone calls from Dad, his voice cracking with a mix of rage and terror as he demanded to know why the police were in his foyer during the middle of his party. I didn't answer his calls, instead, letting him listen to the silence of my absence while the authorities informed his guests that the property was being secured due to a major financial crime investigation. Mom sent a series of texts that escalated from commanding me to fix this immediately to begging me not to embarrass her in front of the Van Horns and the Whitakers. Garrett tried to call me as well, likely because the car he was so proud of was currently being loaded onto a flatbed truck by a repossession agent I had authorized weeks ago. The most satisfying moment came when I received a video message from a disgruntled guest who had recorded Savannah being escorted out of the house in her designer dress, her face a mask of tear-streaked mascara and pure shock. She was being questioned about the forged documents, and without my protection, she had no defense against the paper trail I had meticulously provided to the investigators. The partygoers were forced to leave their half-eaten gourmet meals and expensive champagne as the house was officially shuttered and the locks were changed by a locksmith I had hired to follow the sheriff. By the time the clock struck midnight, my family was standing on the curb of the street they once thought they owned, surrounded by their luggage and the ruins of their reputation. They had spent decades building a facade of wealth, but in a single hour the world saw them for what they truly were, a group of fraudsters who had lived off the blood and sweat of the daughter they despised. Franklin's investment firm would be the next to fall, as the news of the fraud investigation would cause his remaining clients to flee before the first sunrise of the new year. I watched the fireworks exploding over Aspen from a distance, feeling a strange sense of peace, as I realized that the heavy burden of their expectations had finally been lifted from my shoulders. There was no going back from this, and I knew that the legal battles ahead would be long and ugly, but I was finally on the right side of the fight. A month has passed since that night in Aspen, and the landscape of my life has transformed into something quiet, stable, and remarkably honest. I moved my primary operations to a city where nobody knows the Matthews name, and I have spent my time ensuring that the legal consequences for Savannah and Garrett are pursued to the fullest extent of the law. Savannah is currently facing multiple counts of felony identity theft and bank fraud, a reality that has stripped her of the arrogance she once used as a weapon against me. Garrett was forced to take a job as a delivery driver just to pay for a tiny apartment, a far cry from the luxury lifestyle he thought was his birthright. Dad and Mom are living in a small 2-bedroom rental, struggling to understand how to manage a budget for the first time in their lives without my secret bailouts. I have blocked all of their numbers and refused every attempt at a hollow apology because I know they aren't sorry for what they did. They are only sorry that they got caught. This journey has taught me that blood does not give someone the right to destroy your soul, and that the most dangerous parasites are often the ones who sit at your own dinner table. I spent years thinking that my loyalty would eventually earn their love, but I finally realized that you cannot buy respect from people who do not respect themselves. To anyone watching this who has ever felt like the black sheep or the useful child who is only valued for what they can give, please understand that you have the right to walk away. You are not a bank, you are not a safety net, and you are certainly not trash just because you refuse to let people trample over your boundaries. Setting a boundary is not an act of hatred. It is an act of self-preservation that allows you to reclaim your dignity from those who would see you hollowed out for their own gain. I am now entering the most successful phase of my career, but this time every dollar I earn stays with me or goes to causes that actually matter rather than funding the delusions of toxic relatives. Thank you for listening to my story and for standing by me as I shared this painful chapter of my life. If this story gave you a bit of courage to stand up for yourself or to cut ties with a toxic situation, then my experience was worth the pain of telling it. Please share your thoughts in the comments below, as I would love to hear your own stories of reclaiming your power and setting your own rules for the new year. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story about justice, resilience, and the power of the truth. Happy New Year to everyone who is brave enough to start over and strong enough to say no to the people who don't deserve